Good morning. There's been a lot written in the newspapers in the past few weeks about school absence. Apparently, it is now a huge problem in the UK. And a recent poll was taken which showed that more than a quarter of parents said that the pandemic showed that it was not essential for children to attend school every day. The messages over the past few years have been incredibly muddled, and it's hardly surprising that the place of schools within education has been damaged. It got me to thinking how swiftly the world can and does change, how quickly we move from a situation where education is the aim to one where it becomes a pain, at least for some. If you look at the history of education in this country, it was only comparatively recently that education became something that all teenagers were expected to do. The school leaving age was only raised to 16 in 1972. And when I was at school in the 1990s, the leaving age was still 16. It wasn't at the end of year 11, it was 16. I had friends who decided to leave school on the very day that they turned 16 and enter the world of work. I remember being taken aback by seeing people who had worked for years at school and who, in some cases, only had weeks before their GCSEs, decide to jack it all in and go and work for a living. Even then, I was struck by the fact that being in education was certainly easier than the alternative, wasn't it? It may have been the fact that I always loved history that led to my thinking this. I always felt aware that education, the physical act of just turning up to school, was a heck of a lot kinder for children than what young people had been expected to do before at various points throughout history. One of the best things about the recent Christmas holidays for me is that I always get to spend time reading, time that's often pretty hard to come by during the school term. This past break, I've spent a fair bit of time immersed in the Ottoman Empire. Now, this was a Turkish empire that ruled modern-day Turkey and a fair bit of the Middle East and Eastern Europe between the 14th and 20th centuries. The empire was ruled by a sultan, whose wife, incidentally, was known as a sultana. The sultan's private bodyguard of troops were known as the janissaries. They were arguably the first modern, professional, permanent army in history, and may have been the first soldiers to be equipped with firearms as a matter of course. They were tough, formidable, and impressive troops. What's this got to do with education though? Well, these troops were recruited under a practice of what was known as devshirme. This was also known as the blood tax. The Muslim Ottoman forces were occupying Christian Eastern Europe, and they would forcibly enslave young Christian boys and men between the ages of 7 and 20. They'd circumcise them, convert them to Islam, sometimes even castrating them to become eunuchs. All these young men would have to forget where they were from and would be trained up to become loyal, Muslim servants of the Ottoman Sultan. Some of these young men went on to reach close to the very top of the empire. They were brilliantly educated. The education that all these young men received was pretty first-rate and certainly far better than the sort of education they would have received in their homeland of Albania or Greece or Bulgaria or wherever else in Eastern Europe they came from. However, it was dehumanising and it was brutal, and they didn't have a choice. They were violently taken from their families and indoctrinated into a way of life that was tough and Spartan. They were educated though. Now, speaking of Sparta, Sparta was a city-state in ancient Greece, which was famed as the most militaristic of the powers in that region at that time. This means that everything within the state was designed for war. This includes the education system of Sparta. This had a name, agoge, which encompasses the entirety of education and training of all male citizens of Sparta. Boys were taken away from their parents and would sleep in what was referred to as a pack of other boys, much like wolves. They were encouraged to steal food for themselves and were underfed to encourage this sort of resourcefulness. They were given one item of clothing, a cloak, per year. They would largely be working on their athletic prowess throughout their education and will be focused on running and wrestling. Everything was subordinated to the state. The individual didn't matter. The collective whole was the only thing that was important. Education was the means by which the Spartan state guaranteed a strong fighting force and a citizen body that was loyal. It is perhaps no surprise that many millennia later, Nazi Germany looked to the Spartan education model when thinking on how to structure the German state of the 1930s. One thing you'll notice about both these examples, the Janissaries and the Spartans, is that I've made no reference to the education of women and girls. Ultimately, this is because the education of women has been seen for much of the past few thousand years as unnecessary. It was either a luxury that male-dominated societies couldn't afford, or else it was seen as dangerous. If you educate women, then who knows what comes next? They might even want to vote. There are some brilliant women in history who were clearly well educated and formidably intelligent. However, they nearly all have the same thing in common. When we know about them, they come from incredibly wealthy households. In ancient Rome in the 1st century BC, there was a wonderful orator, a public speaker called Hortensia. She famously gave a brilliant, stirring speech in which she told off Mark Antony and the future Emperor Augustus. They were trying to tax women, and she responded in public, in the forum, "Why should we pay taxes when we do not share in the offices, honours, military commands, nor in short the government for which you fight between yourselves with such harmful results?" They decided not to tax women after that speech. There were other women in medieval history, like Hildegard of Bingen. This 11th century writer, composer, doctor and philosopher basically founded scientific natural history in Germany. Little wonder then that she was made a saint just over a decade ago. However, both Hortensia and Hildegard were daughters of aristocrats. They were able to spend their time focused on higher learning because they had the resources and the means to do so. Most women's education was simply focused on the basics of reading and domestic skills, essentially what little they needed to allow them to become wives and mothers. In this country, it was only in the 19th century that education for all became a hot topic. In 1880, an Education Act was passed by Parliament, which meant that school attendance finally became compulsory between the ages of 5 and 10 for boys and girls. However, even 10 years later, attendance within this age group was only at 82%. This was largely because many children continued to work and their income was vital for families who were living on the poverty line. Quite rightly, perhaps, parents felt it more important that their children could eat than that they were able to read. Over the next half century, education became compulsory for longer and longer. Children's ability to work was restricted and drawn back, and welfare provisions were put in place to ensure that families didn't have to rely on their children's labour to be sure to eat. However, in reality, this country has only had about 50 years where childhood and education were intertwined. A period where you could guarantee that between the age of 5 and 16, you would have to be in school and your childhood would be protected. School was better than the alternatives: war, poverty, or work. Now though, today, we've seen a huge rise across the country in young people who are missing school. Over a quarter of all secondary school aged pupils are persistently absent from school. This means that they miss over 10% of their lessons. There are also over a quarter of parents across the country who now think it's okay to miss school. Now, the statistics on the impact of missing school are pretty stark. Put simply, if you're in school, being taught in lessons, you do better in terms of achievement, outcomes, and so, inevitably, happiness. However, statistics only show one side of the reality. we might want to ask ourselves why, as a society, some students and their families don't always see education as the most important thing that a young person can be doing. For many people, the answer to this riddle is COVID. The difference between the percentage of students out of school before COVID and afterwards is clear. There are now double the number of students not in school than there were before COVID. That's a terrifying figure. There are politicians in the news nearly every day talking about how they'll fix it. And that is not an easy ask. For nearly 150 years, we had governments telling parents and their children that education was the most important thing. However, from March 2020, that message shifted. Education was important, but public health was more important. Schools were a problem and were spreading a dangerous disease. Not a disease that was particularly or especially dangerous to young people, but nonetheless. It's hard to switch that focus back now. It's hard to convince everyone that it was okay to spend hours online, at home, doing some work, sure, but not anywhere near as much as in school proper. Equally, that time of isolation during COVID meant that many children around the country became far more anxious and found school far more challenging than they had before. The habit had been broken. Now, habits are what make the difference in how we behave. Across the country, we need to reinforce the habit of going to school. School needs to be better and to be seen to be better than the alternative, if that's sitting at home on your computer learning or not. We are incredibly fortunate here at Prior Park. Our school is beautiful. Our curriculum is engaging. Our teachers are fabulous. Our parents are supportive. Our students, mostly, like coming to school. However, in part, I think that we need to think about what education is for across the whole of this country. So often, you will see politicians and industry leaders talk about education as a means to an end. They talk about an education that trains a workforce. They'll talk about needing to have certain subjects to a certain level, and if you don't, well, then you can't be a useful member of society. The problem with this approach is that it undoubtedly sucks some of the joy out of learning. Education, like in Sparta, can be used to make society look the way you want it to. It could be a society where everyone is a cog in a machine, where everyone has done X subjects to Y levels and so can now do Z jobs. Would you get up and go to school if that was it? If the only promise was a life of drudgery, almost like an ant in a colony? Do your bit and do no more or less. Don't dare to dream bigger. Superficially, school is never going to be able to compete with the alternative. The truth is that school is tough. It involves work and it involves rewards. It isn't social media, it isn't computer games, it isn't Netflix or Disney Plus. It doesn't give continuous hits of dopamine. However, it provides for a much deeper and fulfilling life. It allows you to build meaningful relationships. Those relationships might be with each other, and they should hopefully last the rest of your lives. However, those relationships should also be with your subjects and with the very idea of learning itself. In the modern world, with all its distractions, education cannot be simply about filling in a form or ticking a box. It must be attractive to students. Values like those we have here at Prior should sit at the core of any good educational offering. We talk about courage, curiosity, and generosity as our values. They are vital to our school and to the way we talk about education. We want to light that fire of curiosity. We want our students to approach the world with optimism and generosity. We want them all to be brave enough to challenge convention and to dream big. We haven't got it cracked. We aren't the perfect school, as if there ever could be such a thing. However, if more schools encourage their students to dream and to believe that education is an opportunity to be embraced and not a chore to be endured or a series of tasks to be ticked off, then we might see a little less pupil absence and a bit more joy across our country. We'll finish with a prayer for schools from our school prayer book and written by a Prior Park member of staff. Lord, help us to grasp every opportunity you send and to use every gift you have given us, that we may make our lives what you meant them to be. Amen. I hope you have a great day and a fabulous weekend when it comes. Thank you.